Hello there, and welcome back towards Automation Days Asia 2021. It is my great pleasure to today host our first panel discussion of the conference. And in this panel discussion, we're going to talk a lot more about automation in practice. So as you all know, automation has become one of these most prominent buzzwords in the IT industry. And over this morning sessions, we've seen that it's used for increasing productivity. We talked about efficiency, and ultimately automation is there for better business performance. But how do we do that in a day-to-day business context? How can organizations actually start automation, and how do they adopt automation in their journey? It is more than just a technology. A lot is about culture, a lot is about people. So for today's panel discussion, we're going to dive into that a little bit more in detail. And I've invited some of the world's experts in automation to share their views and comment on that. And over the next 45 minutes, we will go into a bit of discussion on what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of automation and automation adoption. If you want to join the conversation today, by all means do so, because I'm going to be moderating questions. So if you would like to see questions answered by the panel, just put them into the Q&A, which you will see on the right-hand side. For the other participants, you can just upvote questions that you'd like to see answered, or if you have any other comments that you would like one of our panelists to comment on. Good, I'm very pleased today that we have an expert panel that is joining us today, as you can see here on the screen. And let me provide a brief introduction of every panelist. I'd like to start with introducing Peter Leong. And Peter has over 30 years of working experience in banking, finance, and mainly in shared service centers across Malaysia. He's worked in oil and gas, consulting, and advisory and transformation. Peter has been a senior manager since 2010 and has been engaging with some of the leading technology partners across the world. I'm very happy to have you on the panel here today. So big welcome to Peter. Thank you. Our second main speaker and panelist for today is Paul Colmer, who I've known for many, many years, and I'm extremely pleased that Paul is able to join us all the way from Australia. Paul is currently working at Amazon Web Services and has a very fond knowledge transfer style, and you will find him a very engaging panelist for today. Paul has a really strong passion to helping people and developing and growing. And this is also the way that I've come to know him in previous engagements as a trainer, as a panelist, as a speaker. Paul currently works at Amazon Web Services, but is also a recognized and certified trainer in too many areas that I can mention. He's a trainer for cloud, skilled agile, data science, and accredited by APMG, DevOps Institute, and SAFE. So a big welcome as well to Paul. It's really happy to have you on the panel, Paul.
Thank you so much, Jan-Willem. Great to be here, guys.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And then our last main speaker for today is Jan-Willem Lee, who is also very passionate about digital transformation and has been an expert in especially oil and gas for the last couple of years. Jan-Willem is also a very keen learner, and there's absolutely not a week that goes by that I cannot see another certificate that you've obtained online. We sometimes joke at our company that you're probably the most certified person in Malaysia. So John has an expertise in a variety of different regions. So I'm very happy to have all of you on the panel today. Thank you so much for being here. It really makes Automation Days a great way to get started, to have so much engagement and so many great speakers today. For today's kickstart of the panel, we're going to start with just a very basic question, because this is obviously the Automation Days Asia. So I'd like to start our discussion with getting your perspective of what automation means to you in a day-to-day business context. Obviously, it's a buzzword, but in practical means, how do you see automation changing the way you work and changing the way that you operate? maybe it's good to kickstart with Paul for the first question, and then after that I'll move towards John and Peter afterwards. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jan-Willem. So welcome everybody to this panel, and absolute pleasure to be here. So that first question, I think it depends on the business you're working in. So I work, as you know, for Amazon Web Services. I worked for a number of blue chip companies over the last quite a few years, 20 odd years, in Brisbane, Australia. Also worked in the UK. And I think, the broadest context for me around automation is really understanding how you can remain competitive in your marketplace. Automation is more than just about making things more efficient and saving money. Certainly with my DevOps and Agile hat on, it's very much around empowering your employees, providing them the autonomy to be able to make decisions so they can do the best job they can be and be the best person they can be. And so I think that's really important in that context of automation. So in the Amazon Web Services context, we see that in terms of making the best products and services for our customers, and understanding the typically 90% of the features that we deploy are directly asked by customers, and then we have the 10% where we try to understand what they want, read between the lines, and give that innovation. If we're working in a different business context, we might be looking at making teams, for example, more streamlined and using more automated processes. Simply maybe looking at their email, looking at their Outlook. How can I automate some of the junk that I get through? We've got the anti-spam filters to help with some of that removal. We have Outlook rules. Or we might look at a larger context like Tesla. They're one of my favorite use cases, with the manufacturing on steroids, right? Everything is the goal there is to automate everything using robots. And even Elon Musk himself has admitted he's gone too far and pulled back on that. So there's some starting points there to answer your question, Jan-Willem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're mentioning some really great parts. Is that automation nowadays is everywhere, and the question is, how do we deal in this more increased integrated world in which things are going automatically, while at the same time we still need to be connecting with each other. And it's funny that you mentioned Tesla, because I think you're not just a fan, you're also a driver, right?
I am, yes. I have a Model 3. I was very excited about acquiring the Model 3 a couple of years ago, and honestly, I absolutely love the tech in the car. It's amazing. It's great fun.
Yeah, I can imagine. Good. I'm gonna move to John Wee for a second. So John Wee, what's your experience on automation in day-to-day best practices and some of the ways that you've been encountering that in your day-to-day job?
Well, for me, automation, I think it's been a bit of a buzzword, but when we do digital transformation, I think we typically use that as a tool to augment the customer journey, whether it's our internal customer or the external customer. So I find that I think when we undergo that journey, it's just a tool, the way I look at it, how we augment it, because a lot of time we need to look at it from the customer's perspective, the customer's lens, to say that, okay, if this customer is doing business with us, how could we make that experience much more meaningful to them? So automation, to a certain extent, speeds up our response for some of those transactional business that we do on a day-to-day basis. And I think without automation, I think we probably won't be able to do the volume of business that we do on a day-to-day basis. I think that's key. I think, like Paul mentioned, in that AWS, in that sense, they have quite a fair bit of tools that we also take on board and actually do. It's very dynamic, and but I think you need to take the context and to say that, is this automation running you, or is this just a tool? So I take the view that it is more of a tool to really augment your business, the way you want to run it, to make that customer journey or that experience much more meaningful. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And if I can kind of pick your brain a little bit on your specific expertise, you work in oil and gas, which is, I would say, a more traditional industry. A lot of heavy metal and I would say, but very process oriented. How do you see automation involved in looking especially at the automation of processes within the oil and gas sector?
Well, in the oil and gas sector, most of the processes are pretty much defined. Usually when you talk to the business, they say, John, this is how we've been doing it for the last 20 years, 30 years. So I'll be like, okay, so what could we do better? Which part of it that we could actually do better? And typically, if you do a business process mapping, which we have those kind of tools in place, and then we say, okay, is there any way we could perhaps speed things up a bit without breaking the process? That's always key from a governance perspective, to say that if we can do that, what could we do more with? Because as you know, in the current digital transformation for everybody, we've been asked to do more with less. So that's actually one way of looking at it. But I typically pull the team back and say, guys, seriously, it's not just that. You really need to look at it from the customer lens, because that is super important. It's not just about speeding things up, doing more, but how does this benefit the customer? I think that's the underlying question that I always challenge the team to look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, I think that that's a very good perspective to have, and putting the customer first, I think, is still really crucial with automation, because if you don't put that customer first, they're never going to use the service or product in the first place.
Yep, that's correct.
Good. I would like to jump for a second to Peter. Peter is coming much more from a management background, so look forward to hearing your take on the work that you do. How is automation been impacting that, and also especially from your customer's point of view?
Yeah, thanks, Jan. I think pretty much Paul and John has covered a lot of them, right? Automation to me is probably getting the work done more efficient, right? And I think the most important thing is probably like less manual intervention, so and more automation kind of thing. For example, maybe from a management perspective, approval process that we actually get it automated from one point to the other, without getting people or your assistants to actually follow up with the other person on the next approval line kind of thing. So that's pretty much important to me, so that things get approved, any requests get approved, and those requests are being actioned on the spot kind of thing, without any delay or any lags kind of thing within the whole ecosystem. I think that's pretty much important to me from a business perspective, especially in these days of technology as well, right? So I guess that's very, very important.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. So how does it work in your organization? Do you make like calculations on a business case before you start with an automation initiative, or how do you structure that?
Yeah, certainly. We normally do what you call as a value stream mapping, right?
Okay.
Looking at process flow A, B, Z to Z, at the end-to-end processes, and we see that from automating this part of that particular process, how much time that we'll be able to save, how much value it will bring to the business, and that's probably translate to revenue as well at the end. So that's something that we actually look at it.
Yeah, so you're balancing on the two different, the cost and the benefits against each other. Very good. I know Paul has a lot of experience with building value stream maps and also teaching about that and pipelines. So could you expand a little bit on your views on how these kinds of tools will help with automation initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the value stream mapping initiative, one of my favorite techniques. We use that a lot in Scaled Agile, particularly Scaled Agile framework. And we talk about the concepts in DevOps. A lot of people may not be familiar with value stream mapping, but essentially it's understanding the key steps that you go through in terms of a product lifecycle, in terms of delivering a product or a service. So it's not a process map. It's not a detailed process map. It's just those key steps. The rule I have is usually no more than 7 steps. And usually if you can fit it on a page, it would be great. But unfortunately, in some of the contexts like healthcare and financial services, that could be really challenging. But if you can get your overall end-to-end process on a page, starting with how customers acquire your service, all the way through to how you deliver that product or service to your client, and that gives you a good idea then of what that that high level steps are. You can understand where you might have waste in the process, but more importantly, you can then use that to communicate to your entire organization, a part of your organization, and what they do. It's a really, really important communication tool. So a lot of people use it for process efficiency. And And I think the reason that's really important, there's another concept called customer journey maps, which is sort of a similar take on value stream mapping. And this is really important. It's understanding what the service experience is from the client perspective, from the customer perspective. So at AWS, we're crazy about customers. We have this concept called working backwards, where we truly try and understand. We take a lot of time and effort to truly understand what our clients want. And then we work backwards to really understand what they need. And, eventually over time that develops into some sort of product or service, but it always starts with the customer, always starts with their relevant conversations. And that's the part, I think, the job at the Amazon Web Services that I really love, is that customer interaction and really understanding those pain points, and then seeing the journey customers going through to realize how some of the solutions that we provide can help with those, along with our other partners, along with other third parties. So yeah.
And when you build those value stream maps, do you then translate that into some kind of a financial figures? Because we've heard some of the previous presentations today talk about balancing the investments that you would need to make in automation, in terms of obviously the licenses and the tools, but also in getting people up to speed and knowledge to do that. So do you incorporate that financial aspect in any way in your value stream maps?
Yeah, I guess so. When I teach value stream mapping, I don't necessarily use it almost as a vehicle to say, how can we save money? I guess it is an efficiency vehicle. That's almost like the Six Sigma way of doing it. What's more important to me is really, and to AWS, is really understanding how we can use that to improve the customer experience. How can we use that information to be faster to market? So if you like, in some ways, the revenue and efficiency considerations, you will get those as well, but let's make sure that we're relevant. We have this concept in AWS called it's always day one. It's a really exciting concept, and it's always, we are always striving to be relevant. If it's ever day two, we're either dead or dying. So it's really, really important that we understand our customers. People say, but don't you focus on competitors? Don't you try and beat them? No, we focus on customers. And if there are competitors around us that are innovating as well, great. But we like to focus on what customers want. So really, the way I like to look at something like value stream mapping, it's a tool to help you understand and stay relevant in your industry. For me, it's that fundamental.
Yeah, and I think if I look at Amazon, you're definitely not day two yet. So it's a strategy that works.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I hope not.
Yeah, very good. In this conference, we talk a lot about automation and the big growth. Our previous speaker, Thomas, kind of shown some really interesting graphs on the pace with which automation has been growing, especially in the last 5 years. So I kind of triggered me to think a little bit about the way that where we are today versus the growth that we've been experiencing in the last 5 years. John, do you think we're at the top of the curve in terms of hype, or do you think we're just at the beginning in terms of automation?
If you ask me, I think we're still at the very beginning of the automation journey. For us, right? We've been working along with AWS for quite some time now. And every time we take a cloud conversation or we take an automation conversation, my experience is people is like, excuse me, what are we talking about again? so that even though we've been driving that digital transformation, right? And then we said we need to focus on customer. Sometimes it's just on both sides, right? Not just on the business side, but also on the IT or the support side, right? We really need to make sure people really appreciate and align and understand to say that, what are we talking about? We're talking about automation. Okay, how are we going to do this? Again, AWS has got this fantastic methodology. I think I'm also offering. It's not just the day one. I think it's also the working backwards methodology that we also adopt internally to say that, okay, how could we do this better? If we're going to launch this product, right, using the working backwards methodology from AWS, how could we really make sure that this is going to be something that the customer really wants?
Yeah.
So those kind of conversation, I look at it, it's still at the very early stage, despite we have pockets of success. Which is fantastic. Collaborating with AWS team and the other teams as well. But I still see that a lot of people still have a lot of misconception, even with the technical team, right? I always ask them, I said, look, you've done this success story already, this successful implementation, we're getting the benefits and whatnot. So what's next? How do we scale?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Yeah, how do we scale, right? We've got so many. There's only one section of this we're doing, right? What about the other 99 parts that we have not looked at yet? Right. So
absolutely. So I'm kind of triggered by one of the questions I see coming in from our participants today, and because we're told you mentioned that you think we're only getting started. And Jeffrey Luce, who's in the chat, is asking, well, how about maturity? Is there a way with which we can basically measure automation adoption in an organization or where you are today? So I'd like to pick your brain on that for a moment, and then I'm going to move to our management guru, Peter, who can also probably provide me some insights on maturity. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of maturity, I think you need to define what are the phases of maturity that you have within your organization, because everybody is going to be different. Because if you talk to the consulting firms, right, like Gartner or IDC, they have their own models and whatnot. But I think you need to look at it realistically internally to say that how do we define maturity, right? Having a community of practice, we've successfully implemented it in certain areas. Even recently, I had a conversation with the team. I said, look, we're going to do awareness session again. And then they said, but we've already done it. And my question was, who have we been doing it with? Which business community have we been engaging, right? Even the product managers, do they even know what automation is all about? And where does automation actually fit in the whole arsenal of tools that we have? So those kind of things, right? You really need to define that within your organization to say that, have we reached maturity, or we're still at step 1, or between step 1 and 5 maturity, for example, we're in a scale of maybe 3.2 or 3.5. So I think you need to define that, because every organization is going to be very different that you talk to. For us, I think we are probably between a scale of 1 to 5, or in some of the companies I'm looking at, probably at a 3. But sometimes if you talk to a new business, they say, John, really don't understand what's automation. How does that apply? Even the solution architect, right? and they will tell you, say, hey, John, yeah, we know AWS, we can automate. I said, no, guys, hang on. What are we talking about? Which opportunity that we can really automate or not automate? Maybe it's not even a case of automation in that sense. Let's qualify that a little bit better. So I think those conversations still needs to take place until you have reached a stage whereby you have, I think, the tipping point. I think recently Gartner published an article about this digital transformation tipping point, right? They're talking about a minimum of 7% of your population needs to be ingrained or adopting that way of working. So that would be another measurement.
I think that's an excellent perspective, and I like the way that you kind of move towards maturity models as well. Maybe Peter, if you can expand on that a little bit, and also one of the other questions that I coming in that relates towards maturity is, are there any kind of best practices? Because when you talk about maturity models, we typically look at methodologies, we look at how other companies organize this. So can you kind of share your perspective a little bit on what would be good maturity models, what would be best practices that you could apply towards automation?
Yeah, thanks, Jan. And I think, John, we actually touched on a good point on the COP. I think, that's really mature, to be very frank. And from the industrial practice, I think that's something good to look at. And I just recall, like what John was mentioning, AWS do have the workflow studies where you can help to automate. I think that's a really good thing to actually look into. So from a maturity perspective, probably I like to take the CMMI kind of model, right? So there's a lot of phases, like what John also mentioned, whether which phase are you in now. So I like to look at it at probably a 4-5 phases kind of thing. Where at the first stage, where you actually have a lot of explorations, looking at the way the company organization works, what are the processes that you actually currently have, right? That's probably on the ground kind of thing, very basic, but you don't have anything which is documented, which is actually automated in that sense. So you go to stage 2 where you actually get all these things, how to say, being practiced in a way, right? In the company day-to-day organizational, operational kind of work. So the next phase I will look at is probably you're actually on a mature basis. Everything is practice 100% perfect kind of thing, right? So the next level where you actually go, where do you go from maturity, right? So which is where you can actually engage a service provider like AWS to come in and take a look and see what other things that you can actually do to further automate your current automation, right? There would be some gaps in between that you can actually look at to fill up the gaps, right? And you refine them. You probably need some experts like AWS and other service providers to actually help you. So those are the things that I thought, around my thoughts, right? Exploration, put everything in place where you have a process in place, you practice everything perfectly, and then you move to the next level where you actually further enhance it in that sense. So that's some of my thoughts. Yeah.
Good. Thank you so much for that. What I'll gonna do next, I see a question come in that is quite really related to this, and because we're talking so far about measuring automation, looking at what are some of the key benefits, looking at the business case. We've talked about value stream mapping. One of the questions, and let me see if I can project this on the screen. Does everyone see this right now? Is a question that just came in from Mark. Mark is asking, well, we talk a lot about the benefits of automation. Obviously, that's the reason for hosting this conference. But are there also some disadvantages that you can think about? So are there any disadvantage of automation that you can think about, and what are your thoughts on that? Maybe it's good to start with Paul for this one.
No worries. That was a great question. Thanks for asking that question. So I'll give you a specific example. So there are some downsides, I think, to automation. Again, I'll touch on the Tesla example. So Elon Musk, has a vision to make us all an interplanetary species, and Tesla and SpaceX are all part of that sort of paradigm. But we take an example in Tesla's own factory where the mantra was to automate as much as we can. In fact, automate everything was the, I think, original sort of vision that's publicly sort of stated in the media and in the press. And you can see, if you're a fan of Elon, you'll see that in some of his tweets that he's pushing the barrier in terms of automation. But there was a specific job that they tried to automate, and in the end, they realized that it was actually more efficient and more cost effective, and it made more sense to have a human do that particular task. So from memory, I think that was pulling through some of the very complex wiring looms through, I think it was the Model 3. That job is quite complicated. It has to be connected to obviously telemetry at each end, and the wiring has to be very precise, and it has to take a particular path, and that path is not easy to thread by a robot. There's lots of things it has to go through. And so the conclusion, even after, I think, experimenting and I guess failing fast, which is what we all like to see all great companies do, he realized that the ultimate answer was to have a human there. And so there are certainly, when we're looking at large scale automation, there are certain, I think, tasks that are better suited to humans. At the end of the day, I'm sure a lot of clients, your clients, Jan-Willem and AWS and other people's clients, I'm not sure how they would take to having a robot rock up one day and ask them what they want and what their requirements are. So I think there are certainly some very specific roles and some very specific use cases where I think automation or going too far can be a little bit dangerous. So yeah,
I think that's it would make life easier though in some cases.
Yes, and I'm sure there'll be a section of the population that probably embraces that. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I guess we should push the curve, and then it's understanding what people want and then delivering those needs for customers. So yeah, very important.
Absolutely. So I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper on that, because when we talk about disadvantages of automation, one of the key questions that always comes up, and it's also coming up in the panel right now, is the obvious question, are the robots going to take up or over our jobs? I don't know if you see the question being projected right now, but this is a question from Luke asking do you guys think automation will affect the supply of labor? I'd like to start with Peter, and then I'm going to move to John Wee for your perspective on this. So Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, very good thoughts about that. I think I look at it as the fear of automation, right? Probably maybe from a management perspective, I would probably over the years, right? I'm sure I've done a lot of automation as well, and this is some downside of people when you actually engage them, your staff, your team in a automation initiative. So look at it this way, that when we actually do automation, that's probably give opportunity for the people, the labor part, to actually do more value job. After certain processes are being automated, right? What can, for example, I would say the SME of this particular process do? So instead of doing the operational part, these people can actually, give their thoughts, right, towards improving the process in the future, how they can actually bring value to the whole supply chain. So those are some of my thoughts that I can think of. Take away the fear part, right, and you get yourself involved and look at the whole process, right, and then you actually probably be able to actually even enhance and bring value to the organization.
Good. I think that's a very good, and that's something I'm going to write down as one of the key takeaways from this session is get the fear out of automation.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that's a very powerful sentence. John Wee, can you expand on this powerful sentence a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of time when we implement those automation projects, right, we don't take into consideration of the human factor, right? So a good example will be if you automate a factory production, for example, you have 50 workers there and suddenly you probably need only 5. So what do? Right? So you either ask them to stop work and leave the company, or what, you upskill them to do something else. So you see that human factor typically are not taken into the conversation when you automate certain things. When you say, hey, I only need 5 now as compared to 50, so what do I do with the 45? Can you redeploy? Is there other areas that we can upskill these people to do more value add, like Peter was saying, right? So a lot of this stuff, if you don't have that conversation early and you implement it, trust me, it's going to be a failure. So you have to actually broach that conversation very early on to say that we're not going to fire anybody. We need people on the job for something else, right? So there could be things like, okay, now the factory is fully automated. Yeah, 5 people is running it, but guess what? Those robots will break down. We need somebody to maintain and to service them, right? Now, what about the other parts of the factory, the logistic parts, the delivery, the marketing, the sales part? Could we redeploy these 45 people to some of it? Of course, inevitably, there will be some loss in terms of the skill transition because some people wouldn't take it. But if you look at it very positively to say that, hey, we're going to redeploy these resources to improve the overall business operation for something else, that is actually the win-win-win for everybody. But my suggestion is, seriously, you need to start that conversation early as you start looking at the scope of work, whether automation is the right tool to do or not. Have that conversation early. Because if you don't do that at the end of the day, and the guy is going to say, hey, what's going to happen to my job?
Absolutely. And I think that's a very common, but I like what you're saying, the win-win-win. If you look at that from that perspective,
yep,
I think it's going to move you forward instead of the fear and moving backwards.
Correct.
Thanks so much for your perspective on that, John.
No worries.
So you also mentioned a very interesting part is the technology, which is obviously part of this. I kind of want to move into that technology section for a bit, and then we're going to end the panel discussion with a little bit more about the skills and knowledge aspect. So those are 2 main topics that I still want to cover on. So I'm going to start the conversation around technology a little bit more from one of the questions that just came in from one of the participants. And Paul, I would like to get your perspective of that, obviously, since you're working for a major IT vendor, probably one of the largest in the world. The question is how do we select the right tool sets? And I'd like to kind of leave the discussion not to become like, selecting the favorite tool, but in more of a general approach. How do you select what would be the right technology stack for your organization and what would be your advice and guidance on that?
Yes, thanks for that question. I think in terms of tooling, I think the key with selecting a tool is first of all understanding what you're trying to do. What's the business problem you're really trying to solve? I see this a lot with clients. We often, and in previous roles at DXC, we often get too bogged down in technology and too quickly get into the question of which tool should we use. Now, tools are important. Tools do shape the way we do things. And if we have people that are working day in, day out with tools, it's important they have some form of say. And as we know, generally in a lot of organizations, tools tend to be driven from a commercial point of view. But I think it's really, really important to understand what you're trying to do, understand then the range of techniques and tools that you could use. And then you just, like any good tool selection, you try and shortlist those things down. So my area of specialism in AWS is AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. And you've got to be really careful with those types of tools. They're very, very powerful. But also there is an overhead potentially with using, for example, machine learning. So although AWS is a specific example, we offer specific services that do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. They remove the need to manage complex infrastructure, such as the operating system and those types of components. But there's still a lot of effort required around the data side. You've got to understand where to collect the data from. You've got to understand how to clean that data. You've got to understand, is the data biased? Are there any ethical concerns with the data? Where do I store the data? And you haven't even built a machine learning model yet. And so there's a lot of effort in that entire life cycle. So you want to be sure that, first of all, you understand the problem you're trying to solve. And I think the way to get buy-in from stakeholders in particular is to prototype. You have some sort of hypothesis. You think a particular set of tools maybe can help you with that. Let's run a very small proof of concept to understand whether you can deliver some of that business value. And then generally when you show true business value to stakeholders, it becomes very difficult for them to say, carry on, if you're delivering, that business value. So I think for me, that's the most important. I learned some of those lessons when I was at DXC and at AWS. We continuing reinforcing, that type of learning to prototype. Is this what the client wants? If not, we want to get in front of them early and correct, if you like, any elements that they're not comfortable with, and then we go again. And that whole cycle is very, very important. So I think for me, I guess the takeaway from all that is focus on your business problem. And once you understand what the problem is you're trying to solve it in small pieces. Don't go on a mammoth 5-year, tool selection piece. That's probably my best advice.
Absolutely. I'd like to ask you one follow-up question on that, because you mentioned, I can talk for days with you about machine learning and those kinds of topics. So I kind of need to stay within the topic a little bit. But one of the things that always triggers me is when we talk about now these newer, smarter ways, like machine learning, and putting that into automation solutions. And you raised a point that really triggered me is how do we deal with that from an ethical point of view? Because at a certain moment in time, our robots not going to make decisions which are not in line with company policy or worse. So what's your take on that?
Yes. So I think it's very important that we understand what we're trying to do with the data, and understand whether data set is balanced. So that's one of the, I guess, key principles around data bias. So, for example, we might have a whole set of data, we might do some analysis on it, and we realize that it is gender biased, or maybe it's biased in some other way. And the way to understand that bias is again through some form of tooling, some form of automation. AWS, we do have a tool. It's called SageMaker Clarify that helps you understand those imbalances in data sets. But again, it's just a tool. You need to know how to use it. But what's more important is that you're aware that data can be biased, and you have an action to analyze that and then correct it is really, really important. The challenge with data biases is trying to find it. Even with tooling, you still have to understand the context of the data and have to understand the business aspects of that data. So often you need to work with a subject matter expert in that business area you're working with. Like if I take a whole heap of marketing data and look at it, if I'm not a marketing expert, it doesn't mean a lot to me, even if I'm a data scientist, right? So you need that expertise to understand that, and the ethics and the bias are all sort of part of that. But it's very, very important to, I think, put that front in mind and center of when we make decisions, particularly if for example, if we're a financial services company and we're making credit scoring decisions. We don't want to have a model that is biased to favor some people and not others, because one, it's not right, but two, I think you're missing a business opportunity, right? You're losing a whole heap of your customers. So I think it's so important.
Absolutely, yeah, basically, I think it comes back towards one of the famous sayings is the fool with a tool ultimately is still a fool.
Yes.
And kind of that brings me to a nice little bridge towards one of the other major topics I wanted to discuss in this panel today is the discussion around skills, because you mentioned it. If you don't have the ability to look at data and then make the right kind of conclusions, then it's not worth it. And that's the same for any kind of automated solution. So to follow up on that, and I kind of want to switch to John Wee for your perspective on that. We had a question coming in that was asking, besides this automation and besides culture that we just talked about, what are driving organizations towards the next level? I think there's a quick typo here, but I think that's what the question means to say. So what would be your perspective on that in terms of, we talked about process, we talked about technology. What are some of the more soft skill elements that you could look at?
Well, Jane, in terms of soft skill, I think you need to look at it from the reason why do we even want to do this, right? All those buzz and all the cloud, the automation, the technology stuff, right? You need to ask yourself, why are we even doing it? Why do I need to justify to management for this investment and to reskill ourselves to actually even do it? So if I mean, typically when we ask those questions internally, the answer will come back to say that we need to stay relevant. We want to be here as a business entity for the next X number of years down the road. So if we need to be there, then the question is, what do we need to do today to make it happen?
Absolutely.
So those kind of soft skills, right? I think typically when you have that question answered already, then you say, okay, so what do we need to do? So if it's a network engineer, what does he or she needs to learn? Is this programming? Probably. What about security? Because if you look at network and security, that's kind of a blur, or I should say a gray area these days, right? It's kind of mashing it up, right? And then if you look at network, it's like, oh, it's not even network anymore. It's the cloud. So
John, you're referring to a question that I'm probably sure you just saw come in as well. So I'm just going to project that for the rest of the audience as well. And maybe it's good to kind of place your example in the context of this particular question. So we had a question coming in from Arthur that says, well, I'm a hard-skilled network engineer for Cisco and firewall security, etc. So how should they upskill themselves? Is it programming languages, or is there any other kind of approach that they could take? So since you've already started with this question, John, maybe it's good if you finish this one as well.
Sure. So Arthur, I would also recommend that the network engineer would need to have the storytelling skill, because you really need to be able to stand in front of business and explain why network is so key and why security is key. Because if you can't explain yourself from a business perspective, they're not going to approve the funding for you to implement whatever solution that you want, right? And the business is not going to be there for the next 5 years or 10 years, right? So you understand the technical part, but do you understand the business part of stuff? So those are the soft skills I think I would encourage everybody to seriously look at, to say that, hey, I probably need to upskill myself from the business perspective, understand a little bit more what business are we in and how do we continue to stay relevant if we want to be here for the next 5 to 10 years down the road.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, so that will be hopefully that's an example that everybody can relate to.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they will. Peter, can I switch to you for your perspective on knowledge skills? You've been advising a lot on automation in the last couple of years. What are key skills that you are looking for to develop in companies when the discussion around automation starts?
Yeah, I guess, while what John said, to stay relevant, I would want to put it at probably as reskilling, right? You may be doing a certain function like the network, right? But now your organization is going to embark on a different automation path, and you have to review and assess if your current skills is still required, or they need to be rebrand in that sense, right? So, and you see that if you're going to embark on a certain automation processes, right? And what are the hard skills needed, technical skills needed? Well, maybe I wanted to embark so that it will also enhance my development opportunity. I think the other way I look at it is that, to bring value to your organization, some of our technical staff may want to give this a critical thinking a thought, right? To see that, you will, what value you're going to bring to the organization in order that the organization will still stay competitive in the next, midterm, long term, 5 years, 10 years kind of thing, so that like what John said, organization will still be around. I think that's pretty important. There'll be a lot of I know one thing, like for example, we can see that RPA is very popular these days, and they demand very good value as well in terms of pay, right? So those are some things that our technical staff can actually look into.
Good. Thank you so much for that, Peter. I kind of want to ask the last question to Paul, because he's also a trainer in a lot of these different areas. So Paul, what's your take on skills within this domain itself?
Yeah, let me give two answers. So first of all, let me answer that direct question. This is a personal opinion. So particularly with networking, I would say if you're going to learn a language, yes, learn a language. Consider Python. Python seems to be everywhere. There are many AWS services. There were many services at DXC, and Python kept recurring over and over again in the various courses I used to run. And the reason I think that you should learn Python is because my kids are learning Python, and they're probably your competitors in some ways. My kids are coming up. They're only 8 and 11. They're starting to learn to code already, and as many probably children are. And so that's a sort of the very short, pointed answer. The broader sort of answer to the question is I guess you need to understand, I guess, where you want to go with your career. So for me, I was a solution architect for many, many years, and I had a very clear sort of, if you like, vision of where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do and what skills I needed. And I got to where I wanted to go, and then I thought, what do I do now? So I then had to think bigger, and the training and the AWS sort of vision now is really around sort of what I'm striving for personally. So I'm trying to empower people with the knowledge and the skills to be able to harness, sustainable technology. That's sort of my thing at the moment. That's my 10, 15, 20-year vision is when, hopefully when, I'm old and gray and I am, reflecting on my life, I go, wow, I'm really happy with the way in which I carried myself and helped people embrace that sustainable sort of technology. So I think for me, that's the key to understanding what skills you need is where do you want to go? Do you just want a job? Something you just want to earn some money, or do you want a career to carve out maybe over 5 or 10 years? Or if you're really lucky, do you want a purpose? And I think that's what we all strive for. I think Simon Sinek has some fantastic videos around the why, and really the why and the purpose are really those same things. So I've been working very hard the last few years trying to understand my purpose, and it's still changing, but I think I'm on a great path where I am at the moment. But that's probably the best advice, I think, for
Good. Well, that's some absolute great advice to end with. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I could definitely extend this easily with another hour, but we're going to get a new speaker already within 10 minutes. So before I introduce that next speaker, I would like to take a moment to introduce or to thank all of you so much for your words of wisdom. I always really enjoy these panel discussions because you get so much good perspective from a variety of different industry experts. So thank you so much for your time and your well thought answers today. It was really a pleasure to moderate this panel, and we'll do it again somewhere in the future. I see a lot of claps and hands and going all on the screen, so I think the audience is agreeing with me. Good. I'm going to close the session here today because in 10 minutes we have Nick Holton, who is the Chief Operating Officer of APMG International, and he's going to share his thoughts on whether robots are going to take over our jobs. Nick is a really gifted speaker. I've talked with him many times before, so make sure you join that session. That's